modern survival horror games. You love them, I love them. And today I've got a collection of some of the absolute best stuff to ever come out of the scene. I'm not sure why, but lately it's been all about genre mashups, and best believe I've prepared a nice sampling of the most promising titles out there. We've got RPGs, retro throwbacks, experimental strategy games, and just straight up Resident Evil likes. All finally curated by the only man with the experience, the knowledge, and the hairline to get the job done right. What's up, guys? I'm Jared, and this is Avalanche Reviews. Heavy Metal Death Can is a classic take on the established survival horror formula from the Swedish developer Recurrence, slated for release in May of this year. I hope I pronounced that name correctly because that is what I'm sticking with for the rest of this section. And you know, before we even get into specifics, I can say sometimes with a game like this, your setting can be like 80% of the draw. And putting the player in a zombie survival scenario on a submarine, who knows how far below the surface of the ocean, is honestly a genius move. A lot of the time, the developer of a survival horror game is going to have to stretch the player's suspension of disbelief to keep them from wondering why the main character wouldn't just pick a direction and run for their lives. I mean, listen, Jill, I'm not trying to question your training. I understand that there were T-virus infected dogs surrounding the Spencer mansion, but like, you had a bazooka and a shotgun. You should have been able to figure that out. But being trapped in a steel tube under tons of pressure per square inch is a perfect justification for a lonely, isolated atmosphere and a lack of ability to escape. Starting a new game in this demo, we're presented with a short but sweet introduction to the circumstances that put us here. It's 1978, and wrapped up in the spillover of the Cold War, all of the world's most active black metal producing countries have made an alliance called the FSS. You play as a member of a subcrew that was assigned to check out a recent discovery of new life forms in the North Sea. After being attacked by something left a little unclear, you and your crew return to the HMS. Oh Jesus, here we go, let's try this. Domeheden. You know what, honestly, that feels correct. Anyways, after falling into unconsciousness thanks to a wound sustained in the previous attack, you awake in a floating metal coffin filled with mutated semen. Probably not the kind you're thinking of. Although, to be fair, without being able to complete the finished game, I guess nothing's off the table. In terms of continuing that story, you can find documents scattered around that chronicle the chaos that led to everyone around you being taken over by some undiscovered life form, but no concrete answers or full development of what's going on, which is perfect for a demo like this. It just leaves the hooks out for you to get interested. When it comes to actually playing the demo, like I said earlier, this is a classic survival horror title, meaning Resident Evil rules are in play and really not much else. And this should go without saying, but that is by no means a negative. It's just to say that the game is more interested in accurately working within the REs 1 through 3 type of framework as opposed to innovating brand new mechanics or systems. And right from the start, it's going to be very hard to escape the fact that Heavy Metal Death Can is incredibly difficult. The zombies on this submarine can put you down with just a few successful grabs, and you start out without any kind of offensive answer to that reality. But even when you do come across a shovel, pistol, and flare gun, you're still going to be at the whims of a very high degree of toughness. Now, on the plus side, I didn't feel like the game dipped too far into the unfair side of things, but that being said, I would imagine most people, just like I did, are gonna need to get a few deaths under their belt before they figure out how the enemies work and which route is the best to take from the start. When you do get to a point of familiarity, though, you'll still be operating under a strict limit on resources and an environment that makes zombie dodging a necessary skill to develop early on. From what I can tell, this game's version of The Walking Dead have 3 states. One where they have yet to detect you, a slow lurching walk once they know where you are, and a run that they can initiate that locks them into a single, unalterable direction. Ideally, you're going to want them in that latter state because a quick move to either side can give you the wiggle room you need to take advantage of their recovery and get around them. The only problem with that strategy is these things seem to be able to throw a grab out there no matter what state or animation they might be in the middle of, so giving them a wide berth is critical, and in these narrow passageways that's not always going to be possible. Again, this doesn't equal out to an unfair experience, but experimentation and a firm grip on tank controls are going to be a must if you want to see this demo's end screen. Outside of the difficulty, you can expect all of the usual survival horror mechanical suspects. The aforementioned tank controls, a limited inventory, combat requiring a ready button to be held before firing, backtracking across a winding series of locations, and of course, puzzle solving. On the more critical side of things, I did feel like the game's controls were a tad on the sluggish side. Your character's run speed is fast enough, but the speed at which he turns can make for a less than satisfying experience moving around. And in a game that's already asking a lot from the player in this realm, that could probably stand to be tweaked a bit. One pretty cool inclusion is the shovel that can be used to knock zombies to the ground temporarily. Now, the experienced survival horror fan is going to automatically know this could be put to great use as a tool to avoid encounters and save on resources, which is true. But I found that it comes in clutch when choosing to engage in combat as well, specifically when you find yourself in a room with more than one living corpse in it. Being able to knock one down while dealing with the other without worry is incredibly useful, and I thought it was a perfectly appropriate move to only give this thing a limited amount of uses until the player needs to spend a repair kit on fixing it back up. It feels to me like Roofs has a solid understanding of how vital small things like item scarcity and resource management can be for this genre. And while these systems are turned up to a relatively tough difficulty here, I think it's the kind of challenge that fans of survival horror will not only be familiar with, but probably looking for. Speaking of which, this demo only has a single puzzle that doesn't fall under the find a key for a lock method of solving, but I think it's a great indicator that we're going to see some creative stuff in the game's finished build. I mean, this certainly isn't the first time that audio cues have been used in one of these games to indicate a puzzle solution, but it's not the most common thing to see, and I really appreciate the unique approach Heavy Metal Death Can seems to be locked into. And you know, having said the game's name, I should probably also compliment it on being really accurate to both of its descriptors. This is most definitely a death can, and you are going to find a lot of metal-adjacent electric guitar licks in the music here. Something that may not fit perfectly with the setting or era this thing takes place in, but listen, we metalheads aren't so well represented a group in this hobby that I'm going to say no to some tasty riffs finding their way into a survival horror game. Heavy Metal Death Can is, in my opinion, a project to be on the lookout for. It has an incredibly fleshed out visual style, almost perfectly tuned gameplay, and a flat out awesome setting for a horror game. I'm gonna give it a drunken skull out of 10. Score! Alright, listen, I've read the advertising laws, and I am fully aware that I'm not allowed to tell you that every person who has ever supported me on Patreon or become a YouTube member woke up with $1 trillion and 20-inch biceps. I know that I can't say that, but I'm damn near positive I can strongly insinuate it. Look, at the moment, YouTube has me bent over a barrel, there's no doubt, but little do they know I've got an ace up my sleeve. The kindness and generosity of strangers I've never met before. So if you've received a bit of entertainment from these dumb internet videos I make, do me a favor and think about heading down to the description and checking out my support links. At the moment, donations from viewers are the only thing keeping this channel afloat. Honestly, I do believe things are going to level out here on the platform at some point, and I'm not going to have to ask for them anymore. But until that wonderful, glorious day, I would appreciate the hell out of a temporary helping hand. Thanks everyone for hearing me out, and a heartfelt I love you to the people nice enough to send a few of their hard-earned dollars my way. Now let's get back to the good stuff. I'm gonna go ahead and admit I can be more than a little hard to please. I spend most of my time screaming about taking survival horror games back to their roots and sticking close to the formula outlined in the early RE titles. But at the same time, I go absolutely wild for the kind of games that transplant that familiar gameplay style into a completely different genre. Case in point, Vultures, Scavengers of Death, a new survival horror genre mashup looking to release in April of this year. Now, it makes my job a lot easier just to reduce this thing down to a turn-based survival horror RPG because that's a simple concept most people can grasp without an explanation. So that's what I'm gonna do. Just about everything necessary for a full-blown survival horror classification is here. Incremental exploration, item hunting, puzzle solving, backtracking, a limited inventory, and resource conservation. But all of those familiar systems are working within the interactive framework of a turn-based strategy RPG. Moving around the environment, examining points of interest, and engaging in combat all make use of a point-and-click interface. So in essence, you're still going to be performing all of the actions you'd be used to for a game in this genre. There's just an extra layer of obfuscation between you and a one-to-one level of interaction. Really, it's an interesting execution of the whole double genre thing because each one seems to be operating at 100% without infringing on the other. Honestly, I could keep talking about this subject for hours, but let's jump into the specifics before I run out of footage to put in this section. At the start of the demo, we're given a text dump to summarize the story so far. After an explosion taking place at the top of the Eugenesis Tower, the citizens of Salento Valley begin to die and come back as mutated zombies. An evergreen kind of premise that I don't know about you, but I will probably never get tired of. We play as a member of the Vultures, a covert paramilitary unit known for their skills at infiltrating messed up situations and extracting whatever the client asks them to. And the current goal is to head into this zombie apocalypse and bring back anything that could point out how this happened or whether or not it can be stopped. Not a bad little setup. A lot of these survival horror games, they like throwing you into the shoes of a random survivor of this kind of event, but it's also nice to see things through the eyes of a well-trained mercenary who doesn't exactly need to be there. The demo only allows us to play as Leopold, a man who exudes the kind of energy that makes a ponytail and handlebar mustache not optional accessories, but totally necessary tools for survival. This introductory mission has Leopold infiltrating a local police precinct looking for any signs of Dr. Thiago Schultz, a member of Eugenesis staff who came to the police for protection just one day before the disaster. Once you've got your gear sorted and finally put boots on the ground, the number of options can be a little overwhelming. Over here, you've got MP and AP, which are meters that determine how many actions you can perform and how many tiles you can move once combat's begun. So for the moment at least, we don't need to worry about them. Continuing on, we have a list of actions and modifiers. So for example, you can change your movement type from walk or run to sneak. Options that'll become incredibly useful a little later. Below that is a mini-map that I found less than helpful. You can move it around independently from your character, so there is a chance I just wasn't using it right. Movement, like I said earlier, is all controlled with the mouse, and if you played any type of modern CRPG, you'll probably fit right into Vultures with no issue. Using left click, you can move to the selected tile, open doors, and examine items. The mouse wheel will zoom in and out, and holding right click while moving the mouse will rotate the camera on its axis. And while that last one is amazingly useful, if not totally necessary, I couldn't escape the urge to be able to use the thing with a little more granular control. Because sometimes Leopold is oriented in a way that obscures things, or I just might want a better look at something not located around the camera's fixed orbit. As you explore the SVPD, you'll notice that exploration is about as survival horror as it gets. Lots of rooms, locked doors, collectible items, and shortcuts. So progression is going to be a very familiar process for anyone who's been to this channel more than a few times. The combat, on the other hand, that's going to require a bit of explaining. Once you get noticed by a zombie, the game switches into combat mode, which is where those meters we talked about earlier come into play. Action points play pretty much the exact role that you would expect, with each command draining a certain amount of AP. For example, firing your gun at a zombie's center mass and swinging a knife at them will eat up only a single point, but a shotgun blast or aiming specifically at their heads with your pistol will drain 2. MP controls how far you can move during each turn, and once you've either exhausted all your options or you just want to, you can end your turn by hitting the spacebar, which gives your enemies a chance to make their moves. When I first started the demo, I approached combat with a sort of simplistic mindset, standing in place and trying to use my AP intelligently, which ended up getting me killed. On a second playthrough though, I started to see the value of making sure both my AP and MP played a role in my strategy. So after I'd performed the best chain of actions I could think of, I'd just move a little out of range of the zombies hunting me down to ensure I could get another turn of actions without worrying about incoming damage. I also found it smart to take proper advantage of the environment. Tables, desks, and other obstacles can be a really great asset because you can hop over them, but zombies will be forced to navigate around. On top of that, walking into a room with zombies in it isn't always going to mean initiating a fight. You can sneak around under their radar as long as you're not moving fast and you manage to stay out of their line of sight. Like you might imagine, getting the drop on an enemy, depending on the situation, can turn a nail-biting encounter into a pretty easy victory. First and most importantly, any action you take outside of a fight doesn't drain AP, so it's basically a free hit. And while it might be tempting to use that advantage to its fullest by targeting a zombie's head with your pistol, it can be worth it sticking with your knife since the living corpses around you respond to loud noises. With the right combination of luck and enemy placement, you could theoretically clear out a room before anyone knows you're there. There's also a good amount of extra elements to keep in mind during a fight. Status effects like Immobilize can be triggered by a solid hit to the legs, the knife can cause bleeding damage over time, and weapons like the shotgun and Molotov cocktail come with AoE and lingering environmental effects. It's a system that might at first seem relatively simplistic, but the more you engage with it, the more of its potential depth starts to reveal itself. Oh, and huge bonus points for including a Japanese SRPG staple in the form of these prompts that show up, letting you know your chances of a successful hit with the equipped weapon. From what I can tell in this demo, Team Vultures has a potentially incredible game on their hands. Although to be fair, it is an experience that's almost tailor-made for a person like me. That is to say the kind that really enjoys survival horror and turn-based role-playing games, which are two polar opposite genres that may or may not share any fan overlap. So of course it is possible that others may not share my specific enthusiasm, but outside the unique nature of its split genre design, this is just a really solid video game. I do hope the devs end up making proper use of what seems to be a mission-based framework for progression, because that's something that can be easy to mess up and might end up making the final product feel relatively compartmentalized. And this might be a relatively small complaint, but it's kind of weird that the game only goes up to 1440p at the moment. I mean, it's not like the resulting picture is overly soft, but I get the feeling this was a decision inspired by its CRT-like post-processing filter, which I don't really like anyway. So if it's possible, some 4K love in the final game would definitely be appreciated. Outside of that though, I am insanely pumped to play Vultures when it comes out. This could be the final piece of media that forever links the hardcore survival horror fandom and the die-hard RPG crowd. In the last entry of this video series, I talked about Ground Zero, an impressively cool upcoming survival horror game set in South Korea. Sometime after that, Malformation Games reached out offering access to a kind of beta for the game. Essentially, they had finished everything up to a certain point of its runtime, and while I could play through the entire thing theoretically, the devs didn't want me to show off any footage past that point, which I felt like was a really fair deal. I mean, I was able to get around 5 or 6 hours just out of the first 2/3 of the game that they had polished up, so it's not like I'd be hurting for captures to put on screen, but that actually ended up creating a bit of a weird issue. Because as I sat down to gather my thoughts on my time with Ground Zero, I seemed to have way too much to say about it for a short 5 to 10 minute section of an RE clone video, but I also wouldn't feel right creating a longer deep dive on it if I wasn't able to finish the game or show anyone the last sections of it. So I figured I'd use my experience with the beta build of it to advertise just how incredibly fun of a video game it was shaping up to be here, and then wait for a full release before making a long-form video on it alone. In my coverage of Ground Zero's demo, I talked about how you were able to choose between two starting routes before ending up in the city proper, and at the time I sort of expected that was a value add for the game's trial version, but I was really stoked to see that same trick being pulled a few times in the beta. And even more interesting was the fact that each of my selections led to significantly large areas to explore. Like, we're not talking Resident Evil 3's type of replay value where you might see a total of 4 or 5 unique screens with different choices. Here in Ground Zero, you're deciding which location you want to spend the next few hours in minimum. For this playthrough, I decided on the amusement park at the beginning of the game since I went with the beach in the demo, and later on down the line I chose the police station over the hospital. Like I said before, these were substantial commitments. I think I might have spent more than 3 hours exploring the police station alone, and it was exactly the type of survival horror experience that any fan of the genre would be looking for. Lots of files to read, keys to find, roadblocks to maneuver around, and surprisingly, a few secret pickups that are totally missable if you're not paying close attention and keeping your eye on the map's nearly endless little nooks and crannies. There weren't a lot of changes made to the game's combat, moving from the demo to its beta that I could notice, with the exception of dodging, which has been given an invisible stamina meter. From what I can tell, you'll probably only be able to get like 3 dodges in a row, but if you space them out even a little, you shouldn't have to worry about your stamina dropping to 0. Once it does start draining, I really like that there was no video gamey type of indicator, but instead the screen just darkens with a vignette. Moving a bit further into the realm of its presentation, I gotta say guys, I absolutely fell in love with these pre-rendered backgrounds. A lot of areas have that desolated, contemporary city aesthetic that, in my mind, never falls out of style, but scattered around are these more, almost sterile, modern-looking sections that really remind me of Resident Evil 1.5's visual language. You know, it's a little hard to put my finger on the exact reason. I mean, maybe it's a color palette thing or the recognizably Asian architecture, but either way, consider me a fan. Like you might imagine, the use of static backgrounds can be a limitation in terms of being able to move the camera around, but Ground Zero skirts that issue by including screens where your movement essentially acts as a play button for a pre-rendered CG motion graphic running in the background. It was an absolutely wonderful effect that never failed to grab my attention anytime it was taking place. Look, I'm already starting to creep into a much longer ordeal than I was originally hoping for, so let's just call this a full-throated recommendation. At the time of writing this, Ground Zero still hasn't been given an official release date, but based on what I've played, that moment cannot be too far away. And when it does drop, best believe I'll have a video ready to give it the attention it most definitely deserves.
Well, there's nobody here to stop me.
After giving my impressions of Parasite Mutant's demo recently, I was flooded with comments letting me know about Wicked Seed, a game that, despite its title, is somehow not a cheesy porno from the late 80s. And around that same time, King Twitter shitstarter and Aussie reverb fart sound guy G-Man Lives did a video covering it. So to say the least, I had some lofty expectations when I first started its demo on Steam. A full release is and was available when I downloaded the demo, but I wanted to test the waters first, and if I'm gonna level with you, first impressions weren't exactly strong.
What was that?
Not even 2 or 3 minutes in, and I had already come across a lantern sitting about 6 inches away from its handle, which was hovering in the air. And aside from that, a lot of the assets I was seeing gave off big, purchased from a storefront kind of vibes. Also, the cone of my flashlight was just an effect that followed the camera's movement instead of originating from an object attached to my character's hand. As I played further into the demo, I started to notice a good amount of animations would just robotically start and stop without any sort of transitional state. Instead of listing all the stuff that felt janky, I should probably just describe the demo as feeling incredibly rough. Like not quite unfinished, but honestly not too far from it. And all of these flaws began to form the foundation for what was clearly going to be a negative write-up here in this video. But after getting to a point where the game's full moveset and mechanics had been revealed, something wonderful happened. The entire thing just clicked together in the most wonderful way. I started having a blast with it and ran into a series of ideas and a combat system that turned out to be so fun it made up for any of the elementary game design bugs I'd run into so far. Now, I front-loaded this section with all of that negativity because it was my genuine initial experience with Wicked Seed. And even though it did end up totally redeeming itself, just be aware all the stuff that had me feeling pretty raw with the game is still very much in play. So I guess keep that in mind as we go forward. Starting off with the story, we jump into the skin-tight genes of Ella, who is the first person I've ever seen in fiction to share a first name with my abuelita. Ella's headed for Maine because she received a letter from her estranged brother asking her to look into a company he's working for, and when she gets there you can probably guess the series of events that follows. Monsters show up, the landscape warps into an artistic interpretation of hell, and a conspiracy starts to reveal itself concerning a pharmaceutical company or something along those lines. I won't lie, I didn't really care too much about the story in Wicked Seed. I'm not sure why, but it just didn't get its hooks into me, so I started scanning collected documents not for anything related to the plot, but clues on where I should go next or puzzle solutions. For me, I think 90% of the fun came in when the combat was introduced, although I gotta admit the game doesn't do a great job of putting its best foot forward. In what I can only assume was an attempt at gradually introducing the player to its respectable roster of mechanics and systems, it's going to be something like 30 or 40 minutes before you're playing with Wicked Seed's full feature set, which means for a fairly solid chunk of the demo's runtime, you're going to have a lot of the more fun options locked away. When things do finally open up though, and the enemy encounters move out of the tutorial phase and start becoming challenging, man, I gotta say, I was hella impressed. A lot of the people who were initially urging me to play this game gave an elevator pitch of it resembling Parasite Eve, and that is with very good reason because this is an RPG first and foremost. There's equipables to discover, stat-boosting items scattered everywhere, a leveling system, and skills that unlock as you gain EXP. In battles, instead of an AT bar, you have stamina points that accrue over time, which honestly serves roughly the same mechanical purpose, and when you select commands, the world around you slows down for a really cool combination of real-time and turn-based menu-centric action. Now, what I've just described would already make for a fun battle system all on its own, but Wicked Seed has way more to offer. Once you get your hands on the axe, you unlock the ability to block attacks and then a parry skill, and finally the ability to deliver a critical blow when an enemy is staggered, a status that can come from RNG, weapon stats, or the aforementioned parry move. Then you've got this really impressive set of passive skills that can come from attachments or equipment, like this one that automatically reloads my weapon after each kill. And your enemies are working on a similarly deep mechanical level. All of them have individually recognizable attack patterns and special scenarios where they can be hurt more or less depending on your tactics or your loadout. And each one of them have specific conditions that need to be met a certain number of times, which will reward you with stat buffs. There's honestly a staggering number of systems to engage with here, and we haven't even really scratched the surface. There's also a weapon customization mechanic that lets you upgrade stats with a collected resource, attacks that'll take away more or less HP depending on where you're attacking from. There's expendable resources like grenades, healing items, and a limited amount of more damage-dealing ammo, skills you can use that drains from an energy bar that range from quick heals to throwing rocks for added stagger or AoE attacks. It's a lot to take in, and only when I sat down to write this script and list all this stuff out did I finally understand why the developer thought it would be best to stagger all this stuff out over the course of its intro section. It sadly does have the negative side effect of gating off access to the game's most fun assets in its most crucial minutes, but had they have thrown me in the deep end with all of this and maybe presented me with a wall of text and tutorials in the first few minutes, I'd probably be complaining just as much, if not more. So for what it's worth, I do think they made the right move in the end, choosing between the lesser of two evils. Now, to supply the bottom layer of this compliment sandwich, I really do have to reiterate how rough a lot of this game can be. Animations look weird, enemy attacks can lack any impact, and your environment ranges from bland to okay-ish. I think the best way I can describe it is that even as Wicked Seed was impressing the hell out of me, I was still constantly being hit with evidence that its developer, Dead Right Games, had probably never made a video game before. Which, to their credit, could also be turned into a compliment, seeing as how they took a swing at a really dense and complex stack of systems and made them all incredibly functional. You can tell the artists that worked on this game were very proud of how good the main character's design is and how her skin is realistically textured, because they made sure it was impossible for the player not to get a real hard look at their work when crafting. No, I'm still here. We're gonna sit and look at this for a little bit. Outside of the number of polygons they stuffed into her model, Ella will also show wounds when her HP starts to drop, and in cutscenes she could be seen sweating and dirty from her affairs. Pretty impressive stuff, and really I could probably go back and forth with this thing for hours, but the bottom line is that Wicked Seed is an example of having so many good ideas in a game that it doesn't really matter if all the small connective bits around those ideas are just barely being held together with hot glue. I mean, sure, I could bring up even more of the issues I found, or I could just tell you how unbelievably satisfying it is to perfectly line up a stagger, follow with a few shots from your gun, deliver a swing of the axe, and end with a perfectly timed parry of some other enemy's long-range attack.
Damn it, Jacob! What did you get yourself mixed up in?
Wicked Seed is genuinely way more fun than it has any right being, and I will 100% be buying the game, if anything just to stream and share with a few buds. That being said though, I think the best work to come out of this team has yet to come. There are a lot of what I would call rookie development mistakes here and potential evidence for a very small budget, which are two issues that I think could easily be remedied by Wicked Seed getting some healthy attention and a good amount of sales. So if you are worried about some of the critical statements I've made here, give the demo a try and make sure to give it some time to cook. But otherwise, I would say putting a 20 down for its full release not only gets you a stupid fun horror RPG combat system, but it's also an investment in even better executed ideas from a developer that seems to have more than enough of those to go around.
Ugh. What kind of animal could do this?
I feel like I'm going insane.
Hey guys, I'm recording this after I've finished editing the video because I found out that the name of this game isn't Massacre at the Carnival, but Carnival Massacre. A mistake I am going to make like 7 times throughout this section. And the insane thing is, I changed the name in my script to the right one, and in my mind, I thought the correct one was the incorrect one and that I hadn't changed it, so I reversed it while I was speaking it. Long story short, I've lost my mind. Content creation has broken me, but I'll be replacing each part where I say the wrong name with the right one, and it's going to sound really, really dumb and robotic. Just wanted you guys to know ahead of time.
Welcome.
What the?
Ho, 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 ho.
Norbert Baragni's Carnival Massacre is a pretty interesting situation. Unlike most of the games we tend to cover in these RE clone videos, this one is actually out and available for purchase at the pocket-friendly price of just $5. And if by the end of this section you are thinking about trying it out, I'm gonna go ahead and tell you now, just pay the $5. Because A, it's definitely worth the price tag, but B, you're not really gonna get an accurate read on the game based on its demo. Honestly, not even close. I, on the other hand, started off with what you would assume is the sensible route, playing the demo first to see if Carnival Massacre be worth putting in this video, and I ended up really enjoying it. It was a bread and butter, classic style take on the survival horror genre that showed a lot of promise but had a few issues. Like, it was supposed to have controller support, which I guess it did to a degree. I mean, you could move around in-game, examine items, and shoot things, but the mouse would still be needed to be able to make any sort of selection or confirmation. You can't even start a new game with the controller. You can highlight the option, but you're going to need to click on it with your mouse to actually activate it, and the same goes for picking up items or equipping weapons. That being the case, I decided to switch to keyboard and mouse, which was easy enough since tank controls translate to ASWD surprisingly well. After that little issue was sorted, I noticed the main character's run speed was frustratingly slow. Now on the plus side, it's not like any of the enemies in the game were breaking the land speed record to come after me, so it wasn't detrimental in that sense, but it just kind of felt nasty to be moving so slowly. And if you ask me, if you are going to purposefully have the player's move speed be at the snail with no particular place to go setting, a quick turn is an absolutely necessary mechanic, which is something this demo doesn't have. Along with, and this is a really confusing exclusion considering the genre, a map. Now, having talked all of that shit, I do have to say I came away from this demo with the impression this guy might genuinely be onto something. I mean, there were a myriad of issues and it was in a very rough state, but in spite of all that, there was a kind of gravity to the game. I just couldn't help but appreciate its unique atmosphere, and the classic survival horror gameplay was well on its way to being really fun. Like, once you got rid of all of the downsides, it had all the trimmings a fan of the genre could want. An awesomely creepy environment to explore, tons of key hunting, classic Resident Evil style combat, a limited inventory, connected item boxes, and saves that cost a finite resource. The raw materials were most definitely there and worth appreciating despite the hard to overlook issues all around. Norbert was even nice enough to include 3 options for the game's internal render resolution: 360, 480, and 720p. For a dork like me, that kind of granular control over a game's presentation is an amazing feature to include. Now, to my eye, 360 was a little too garbled in the fine details, and after a frankly embarrassing amount of time comparing the 3 settings, I went with 720 for its more recognizable details and sharp lines. Really though, regardless of which one you choose, it's just awesome that the choice is there in the first place. So with all of these positives sharing the same space with a whole lot of negatives, I decided this was a scenario well worth further investigation. So I threw $5 down on the table and checked out Carnival Massacre's finished release. And on starting it up, I was flabbergasted by how much it differed from the demo. Truly just gasted my flabber all over the place. And to be clear, I don't just mean that the full game fixed a lot of the bugs from the demo, although that is very much the case, but it was more like this is an entirely different video game. Where the demo started off as a simplistic but really accurate retro survival horror gameplay style, the finished version plays more like Casper Crow's Alyssa or Dino Crisis 2, with each enemy dropping what used to be save tokens but are now a resource economy handled by this fortune-telling robot. I know it's a small change, but it fundamentally alters the direction things head in from a gameplay sense. Outside of the interactive stuff though, there was an incredible amount of alterations made to the game's formatting and presentation. Most interestingly, the demo included this Silent Hill 3 inspired intro sequence where the main character Harley starts the game en medias res, walking around a location she would later explore, and after dying is awoken from a nightmare in an empty diner. Even the piercing light from the setting sun beaming through the blinds was included. But here in the finished product, that entire idea is scrapped in favor of Harley just waking up in the diner to a news broadcast mentioning her and, more importantly, her missing sister.
Back-to-back disappearances have left the small county of North Prairie shaken. A teenage girl was reported missing just this morning.
I can't help but wonder why this SH3 homage was removed, because I personally found it to be an effective setup and, tasteful as far as these things go. although I will say that the game's actual intro is much more useful as a story lead-in since it actually says out loud that Harley's looking for her sister, which in the demo was a piece of info only included in the digital manual found in the options screen. But hey, on the plus side, this Silent Hill 2 reference did make it through to the retail release, which is nice. Sadly, my beloved resolution settings have been reduced down to a single toggle labeled retro filter. Enabling this essentially activates the demo's 360p mode with the default res being 720. Perhaps not the biggest loss that the gaming scene has ever experienced, but I really liked having the option to see the game's graphics in 3 separate internal render resolutions. Stepping away from the differences between the 2 versions of the game, because I know I've been harping on and on about that, I had a lot of fun with Carnival Massacre. Its setting was incredibly interesting and, despite its compact nature, felt intricate and satisfying to explore. And for a game that only took me 2 hours to complete, there was a respectable arsenal available. Its music ranged from kind of generic but appropriate to oddly chosen, with this shoegaze track playing over the last boss encounter, but overall I enjoyed it. Progression felt on point and really well organized. The key items were placed in all the right spots to reward exploration, and puzzles were more than respectable. The inclusion of a notepad that lets you jot down details was a standout feature that I don't think I've seen in any other genre release outside of the Nintendo DS, which is something I'd like to see change soon because it was fun as hell coming across clues and manually scribbling them onto some pocket memo pad. The slow run speed from the demo seems to have been tweaked just a bit. Maybe. I could have just gotten used to it, but either way it felt closer to good than bad. My guy even included a map in the full game, although the fact that it doesn't show your position in a room and the awkward controls on this screen made it just about as useful as the demo's lack of one. And you know, now that I mention it, that was a sticking point for me with this entire game, the controls. I've noticed in a lot of Unity titles, developers seem to not be able to tackle the X-Input API that allows for access to a Microsoft controller's trigger buttons and D-pad. Knowing that company though, maybe that's a licensing thing and they have to pay for it. Regardless though, you'll be using your tank controls with an analog stick and holding down the less than comfy left bumper to aim your weapon. And for some reason I cannot decipher, your usual type of menu navigation was scrapped for a system that uses the controller to emulate mouse inputs. So you'll have to use the left stick to move this frustratingly slow cursor around the screen for any scenario where a selection needs to be made, which can vary in annoyingness. Like selecting yes or no for object interactions, it's not too bad, but moving this little dot all the way up to a weapon at the top of your inventory, then all the way down to the equip button at the bottom over and over again throughout the game, it can be a real pain in the ass. If you're a survival horror game dev, just please listen, this is not a sector of game design that is in sore need of innovation. Being able to highlight menu items with directional inputs is about as good as it gets. Alright, so I am genuinely sorry about the long-winded nature of this section, but I just had such an interesting experience with this game and its radically different demo that I kinda had to share it with you guys. The conclusion of all of this, though, is that Carnival Massacre is a really fun survival horror game and well worth its sticker price. If you ask me, $5 for about 2 hours of enjoyable gameplay is more than a respectable return on investment. And it seems like I'm not the only one who thinks so. For just the relatively small number of reviews it got on Steam, more than 90% of them are positive, which I would say is well deserved. Here's hoping our guy Norbert uses this successful release to inspire another entry in the retro survival horror genre with an even bigger scope and more interesting ideas. Cheers, big dog. Recurrence is a game I only recently found out about, which, by the way, shout out to survivalhorrors.com. That place has become absolutely invaluable for producing these videos. Back on track though, developed by Equinox Interactive with a planned release date of sometime this year, Recurrence has surprisingly had a demo out since October of 2025. And right up front, I want to say that this game has an amazing amount of potential and a visual identity that's far more realized and well established than a lot of games in this new indie arm of the survival horror genre. But at the same time, I think there are a lot of bugs to squash before this thing is ready for the light of full release. Before we zoom in on the specifics though, let's cover the basics. Recurrence is a part of what I've been calling the modern survival horror hybrid, a type of game that sticks to most of the core tenets of the genre but breaks away from orthodoxy to implement more modern or experimental game design principles. In this specific case, that means a general experience that's like 95% classic genre fare and the other 5% over-the-shoulder shooting. Not a bad ratio in my personal opinion. You play as Vera, a researcher in the far-off future who is awoken inside the body of a replicant. Exactly what's led to the chaos of her current surroundings and the creatures roaming around is left fairly vague. Like you'd want from a game like this, you come across a lot of personal logs and reports that hint at something approaching an explanation, but at least in this demo there's a lot of holes between points A and B. I was able to find some text that I think points in the direction of this all taking place on some planet other than Earth and the discovery of some kind of mysterious signal emanating from space. Maybe. I will say everything I've been able to put together reads like a psychological thriller, which I am very much on board with. Usually when I play demos like this, I get really stoked at the concept of seeing more of the world that's being set up, and that is also the case here, but Recurrence is one of those rare titles where I'm mostly interested in playing just to unravel the puzzle of its story. Moving on to its polar opposite though, we're dealing with a familiar gameplay setup sitting inside what I would call a very novel concept. Instead of coming right out and saying it though, I think I'll walk you through the events as I experience them, because giving you some surgical explanation, it kind of takes away from the fun of discovering all of this as it unfolds. So when the game starts, you press a button to wake up and immediately you're hit with a crushing realization that you'll be using a modern analog stick method instead of the evergreen, incredibly popular tank controls to move around. And before too long, I noticed that having the run button mapped to the left bumper on a Series X controller is sort of uncomfortable for my hands. Like hitting that thing a couple times in combat or something isn't a problem, but holding it down for long periods of time puts a bit of strain on my index finger. I've broken that knuckle more times than I can count though, so we might be able to chalk that up to a personal thing. But regardless, the ability to remap controls in the finished product would be a godsend. After getting acclimated to the controls, which honestly do feel pretty great, I was very relieved to find the game's exploration follows the Resident Evil school of design incredibly well. You start off in this building's residential sector, so you'll be moving through people's apartments and changing rooms one by one, picking up resources, bypassing obstacles, and solving puzzles. 10 out of 10, very good stuff. Once you get your hands on a pistol chambered in 9mm, the combat reveals itself, and while the bones of a fun system are definitely here, it leaves a bit to be desired. I guess overall my issue is a lack of any punch or impact in fights. Maybe it's the sound effects being a little weak, the enemies jittering into the same exact animation for each hit, or the fact that on death they immediately collapse into a weightless ragdoll state that more resembles a temper tantrum than anything else. I can definitely see this turning into some enjoyable combat with a few tweaks and the right amount of attention before launch, but at the moment I would say it's not a lot more than acceptable. Not long after arming myself, I was exploring an apartment when a sudden sound effects sting jump-scared the living shit out of me.
I wet my pants. I'm gonna need a new pair of pants.
I wasn't really sure what it meant, but it happened right after I picked up this key item, so I thought maybe that triggered it. I wasn't really sure, but I was so into the exploration, it was kind of easy to let something like that fall to the wayside. After solving a pretty good puzzle, I moved on to the office level of the building, and as I moved through the area, this vignette started to show up on the periphery of Vera's FOV. Now, instinctively, I formed a corollary connection between the two, but I still wasn't clear on what was causing it, so I moved forward, until I noticed it was getting worse. Eventually, it revealed the kind of visuals that'll remind a person of waking into sleep paralysis, and not long after that, Vera just collapsed dead right there on the spot. At first, I figured maybe this was some kind of a clever demo timer, making sure the player didn't have a chance to make it into parts of the game that hadn't been finished yet. But after being booted back into the starting room, it became clear that wasn't what was happening. From what I can tell with the limited info on hand, this planet called Titan has discovered a signal that may or may not be coming from its core, and this has had some sort of a detrimental effect on time itself. I'm not really sure if this is a localized thing or if it's spread outside of the planet, but as far as Vera is concerned, it's Majora's Mask rules from here on out. Interestingly, each restart leaves your previous progress completed, so puzzles stay solved, rooms still read as being explored, and locks remain unlocked. You also get to keep your key items on you, like your pistol, flashlight, and any puzzle pieces. The only things that get redistributed throughout the map are usables like ammo and health sprays, which force some interesting decision making on me. Because sure, I could proceed forward trying to make more progress, but it might not be the worst idea to allocate a bit of my limited time towards re-exploring a few rooms with the goal of stocking back up on resources. Once I actually figured out what was going on, it seemed like a very cool concept, one that I can't wait to see fully realized, but like I said at the start, there was a lot getting in the way of the enjoyment I felt like I could be having. There weren't any single game-breaking issues, but instead it was more like an army of tiny bugs that countered every positive I was experiencing. For instance, I was fully into the game's atmosphere. The hazy, low-poly look, decomposing environment, visual storytelling, and general spooky ambiance, they were banging on all cylinders. But the effectively moody track playing in the background kept skipping. I assume it's happening when it repeats itself, and normally that might not be worth mentioning, but Recurrence uses this track instead of background music, so for most of the demo, it's the only thing that isn't a sound effect you'll be hearing. In that same vein, the controls were working really well for me, but the camera was a totally different story. It seemed to be operating like the system used in the good Silent Hill games, but somehow even more unwieldy. In my humble opinion, maybe a fixed perspective would work a little better since the player can already aim their weapon in third person to get a better look at anything the camera might be leaving obscured. Back to the whole atmosphere argument, I loved how dark the game is and how useful the flashlight is at revealing just how bad your surroundings have gotten. But the fact that it relies on a limited resource like batteries really works against its utility. Now, it's worth mentioning that it also serves another function, as the UV setting can be used to clear these tentacle things that might block your way, so I get why the developers might have it working this way. But what if the regular function of the flashlight didn't drain its battery, but instead only the UV setting did? Kind of like how it works in Alan Wake, because in some areas not having a light only stood to take away from the visual mood of the game, but I often didn't want to turn it on for fear of running out of juice. And even worse, when it starts getting low, the light becomes this sort of yellow color, which, I don't know, it's ugly in my opinion. Alright, look, I can admit that one's petty, I get it, but it's still something. Another problem that really got on my nerves was that Vera runs noticeably slower when the pistol is equipped than when it isn't. Looking back at the footage, it's almost like having a gun in her hand causes her to limp, which I guess might have been fine if the game wasn't also operating under a looping time limit. I mean, those two ideas work fine on their own, but together they just don't make any sense. On a similar note, I loved the in-game map, but since it doesn't show roadblocks, puzzles, or my own character's location on it, navigation was a lot more stilted than it needed to be. Orienting myself near a landmark like a specific room entrance, it works sometimes, but when I was in the office where most of the doors aren't labeled like they are in the apartments, getting around was honestly kind of tough. Moving out of the realm of intentional design and into the world of glitches, just like Post-Trauma, a great indie survival horror game I covered last year, I was able to get Vera to hover forward by tilting the analog stick just enough to get her to move, but not enough to trigger her walk animation. And at one point, turning on the flashlight's UV mode caused the frame rate to take a massive shit, which really bummed me out because I thought I'd have to restart and lose all of my progress. Luckily, after a while, I turned the flashlight back on and cycled between the normal and UV modes, which solved the issue, but after that point, every time I used UV, the game would slow to a crawl until I switched back. So I guess turning the flashlight off while in the UV state was what was keeping things slow. Alright, so I know I just spit pure venom at this game, but I think it's important to reiterate just how much I enjoyed it. Recurrence has a staggering amount of potential, and once again, some of the most impressive and artistically pleasing visuals of any game featured in this video. I mean, the looping gameplay mechanic, the mystery of its story, and the psychological nature of its horror, they're all just banger ideas. I just need some of the ground floor game design to be a little more solid. This team has absolutely nailed a lot of the more difficult aspects of making a video game, but they seem to have done so by letting some of the rudimentary stuff slip through the cracks. But hey, that's what demos are for, and I can't recommend any harder that you guys download this one for yourselves and maybe let the devs know what you'd like to see in its finished package. Because I really can't stress enough how good of a video game this could end up being. Hopefully its developers either see this video or get similar opinions on Steam, because if a few tiny screws get tightened here, I could see it turning into an honest-to-goodness survival horror classic. Let's start this one off with a confession. This is, to be honest, not the kind of game I usually go for. But you know, one of the most entertaining aspects of working on so many of these RE clone videos is that they often force me to go outside my comfort zone. Try out stuff I'd normally pass up on. And no offense to this game's developers, but with a name like Cozy Game Pals, the last thing I'm thinking is rock-solid horror chops. That being said, today is one of those times where ignoring my gut instinct was the best thing I could have done.
It's going to be okay, Vivian. Take deep breaths.
Fear the Spotlight is an amazingly cool mashup of classic adventure game and survival horror elements, out now for just about everything with an HDMI output. At first, like most games I talk about in this series, I started off with its demo, but after maybe 20 minutes, I knew I'd want to see this one through to the end, so I opened up Steam and was able to snag it on sale for just $5, which was awesome. But make no mistake, I was more than willing to drop the full $20 price tag after seeing just how expertly the game handles its horror atmosphere.
Where are you?
The story here is one that I think feels really appropriate for the game and perfectly suited for keeping the player moving forward towards a goal, but admittedly isn't my preferred style. We take on the role of Vivian, who shows all the telltale signs of being one of those book-learning nerds. The game's events start with Viv sneaking into her school with a fishnet-bedecked friend Amy, a girl who fits into that performative mall goth stereotype like a glove. I judge from experience. The stated goal here is for the girls to sneak into the library and get their hands on a newly acquired Ouija board so they can perform a seance. Only when it starts, Amy reveals she's got a hidden agenda when she pulls out a burnt rose left in her locker and the revelation that she's been feeling as if someone's following her lately. A potential breach of trust? Maybe, but it's not like Vivian can talk any shit about secret intentions because her goal tonight was to confess that she has feelings for Amy. Once the two start the ritual, the supernatural activity goes from 0 to 100 in a nanosecond, and Amy disappears into a light-filled void. At the same time, a fire starts to spread, which plays into the history of this school, as we found out early on that the place is just a set of renovations sitting on top of the ashes of its previously burnt-down foundation. When the blaze begins to close in, we guide Vivian into a huge hole that appeared in the wall, one that exits into what seems to be the school before its dance with the eternal flame. And past this point, the modus operandi becomes twofold. A, find Amy and get her out of this poltergeist dimension. B, avoid this wild-looking spotlight demon. As you move through the school, little notes, records, and communications can be found that flesh out the events preceding the fire in the 90s. There's a bit of drama concerning a guy forming a crush on the school's quiet, awkward girl, some familial connections insinuating a bit of nepotistic favoritism, a faculty more interested in business politics than student welfare, and the lifeblood of any school, bullying. Now again, this isn't the kind of story that gets me on the edge of my seat, usually, but it feels right for the game and ended up making a really solid impression on me. In fact, the impact was strong enough that I decided to go back through the game's events a second time with my wife, and both of us had an amazing time with its narrative and strong, atmosphere-rich exploration. Speaking of which, the gameplay in Fear the Spotlight is a hybrid of sorts. The survival horror side of its influence spectrum has you moving through this spirit manifestation of a high school, one locked door and brain-teasing puzzle at a time, which was just an absolute dream in my opinion. On the note of that last subject, I was really relieved to see that the puzzles here stayed closer to believably appropriate roadblocks than your average Resident Evil style statue pushing or gem hunting. Stuff like finding a tool to unscrew vent covers, fixing a fuse box, and replacing levers or handles to perform some kind of mechanical feat. And you know, there's something really impressive about being able to put together mostly real-world inspired puzzles in a survival horror game without resorting to esoteric actions or adventure game logic. Of course, there is the odd example of out there stuff like putting a rose in a pair of mechanical hands to unlock a door, but those are the exception and not the rule here. The other half of its dual gameplay loop is keeping out of sight of the spotlight guy, a stalker type of antagonist who will levitate your ass in for a command grab the second he has line of sight. Like I said at the start, this is usually not my kind of system. One of my personally held beliefs is that survival horror requires at least the option to engage in combat, even if the game incentivizes the player not to take that route. So at first I was a little disappointed when I saw the game gearing me up to run and hide exclusively. But you know, if you are going to chase a style like this, I think Cozy Game Pals made all the right decisions by making sure it was effective as humanly possible. The audio, visuals, and overall mood kick into high gear when this guy's around, and the tension it provides is something even I have to praise. And since we already touched on the subject lightly, another really impressive aspect of the game is its just pitch-perfect visuals. The dithering, color banding, animated 2D face textures, and draw distance, they all perfectly invoke that PS1 aesthetic. And while I'm always going to appreciate a good 4x3 image in these retro throwbacks, it's also nice to see these kinds of old-school graphical tricks filling a full widescreen aspect ratio. And special kudos to the lighting, which is basically the central pillar holding up a large portion of this game's atmosphere. All things considered, this is an amazing looking release that, in my opinion, shows off a kind of talent I wouldn't have expected from a two-person development team with only 2 other games under their belt. Like a lot of other indie titles in this genre, you're given a bit of control over the image with tweakable settings that alter the frame rate, texture warping, camera wobble, and add a TV filter. Usually, you guys know I'm a warts and all kind of guy when it comes to the PS1 graphics thing, but if given the option, yeah, I'm going to skip out on affine texture warping. And really, I'm not sure camera wobble would add to the experience very much, so I turned that off as well. Oddly though, I opted to leave the TV filter on and set it to about 75%, which is rare for me. Normally, I prefer sharpness over everything else, and it takes a special skill set to accurately recreate CRT effects. But I think in this situation, the added blur of this setting helped make the game's picture a little nicer to look at, especially in really dark scenes. As for the frame rate, I found a pretty interesting scenario where if I had my monitor set to output 120 frames per second, the smooth option would result in 60 and retro dropped it down to 30, which I would imagine was the intended effect. But while I was running it at 144 Hz mode, those two settings would give me 72 and 36 FPS respectively, which is not a complaint. It's just when you have my specific type of detail-oriented OCD, this is almost as interesting as the game it's happening in. Branching from the sights to the sounds, I really enjoyed the auditory experience Fear the Spotlight provided. Instead of music, most of the areas in the game rely on ambient sound effects and environmental noises to set the stage, and the result is an incredibly immersive game world. In the moments where music is used, it's like 95% groaning note work and harsh clanging to 5% actual song structure, which, it fits the mood of the game really well. I mean, sure, you're not going to be humming a lot of these tracks when you're finished with the game, but they do their job just fine. And in a surprising move for both this genre and indie games in general, the voice acting here was top-notch. Vivian's voice embodies her nerdy, determined, but not quite a hard-ass character archetype perfectly, and Amy's got some serious acting chops with her needing to portray a few different personality types.
Well, if someone can't focus because of a cool pair of boots, that's their own fault.
It's a rose I found in my locker last week. I don't know how it got in there, but it's all burnt and old. I just finished getting ready. Please, tell me you'll make it to the theater to see me.
I'm sure you can already tell, but I am very glad I didn't judge this book by its cover. Fear the Spotlight has been an incredible find for me, and even though I only dropped a $5 on it, I think its sticker price at $20 is more than worth what I got out of the game. In any other volume of this ongoing Resident Evil clone series, this would have been the #1 game on the list, if anything just for the sheer fact that I wanted to play it again with my wife right after beating it. So if you find yourself at home on a stormy night with a good pair of headphones and any recent gaming device, I'd say you're primed and ready for one of the most interesting and fun survival horror games I've covered in a very long time. Well guys, thank you very much for sticking with this video all the way to the end. And your reward for being conscious all the way up to this point is getting to listen to some questions and answers from you guys, the people who watch and support this channel.
What is the favorite movie you never get to talk about much?
Easiest question I've ever answered in my entire life. Clue from 1985. No doubt, put that down, that's the answer. There's no considering anything else. I know that this is going to come across as hyperbole or exaggeration, but I'm being dead serious when I say that might be, in my opinion, one of the best movies ever made. I mean, honestly, it's got it all. Comedy, horror, drama, suspense, mystery, Tim Curry, fucking Lee Ving from Fear. Absolutely amazing. Best movie ever.
Have you at any point felt conscious about your size in Japan? Too tall for certain entrances and exits, too big to comfortably fit inside a Japanese home, car, boat, etc.
Honestly, that was something I was initially sort of worried about, but I haven't found it to be a problem at all. I think I've lived in Tokyo for about 4 years, and I've visited the countryside a whole bunch of times, and I really haven't encountered a lot of situations where I was too big for my surroundings. Sometimes you find yourself in these really small izakayas, but they're kind of small to everybody. I'm sure it helps that I'm not really the tallest guy in the world. I'm 5'11", so I might just be sitting at the absolute limit for living comfortably here, maybe. I think the only thing I've ever run into was a door frame when I was in language school that was just at the right height, that if I walked through it at a certain portion of my stride, the very tippy top of my head would touch it. But outside of that, I think it's been pretty easygoing in terms of fitting into stuff.
What do you think of the mainstream metal bands like Bad Omens and Dayseeker that got further and further away from the genre?
I don't think I'm a very big fan of modern day mainstream metal. Going back and listening to the stuff that was played on MTV and the radio in the 90s, stuff like Pantera, Primus, Typo Negative, Metallica, the stuff that was really popular, I find that to be so easy to listen to, but metal nowadays sounds pretty rough if it reaches the mainstream. Really, I think the genre that's dominating right now in terms of underground stuff that has made it to the chart-topping status is hardcore. You have stuff like Turnstile and Knocked Loose just banging out gold records. I mean, I guess nu metal is starting to make a comeback at the moment, but I feel like that's all still relatively underground. It's not reaching that, played in front of millions of people status yet. Really though, my opinion doesn't mean much. I'm an old guy. Everything that happened after Machine Head, I'm unaware of essentially, so you might not want to listen to me.
Any horror games you found offensively bad?
Alright, I'm gonna say it, but you're not gonna like it. I absolutely hated The Evil Within. I think that's one of the worst, most overhyped horror games of all time.
Thoughts on long-time horror gamer coming to dislike puzzles or anything that stops forward momentum? Been playing since the mid-90s and I just want all gas, no breaks.
I'll level with you, I can fully understand that headspace. I have found that as I've gotten older, my patience for things that get in the way of the flow of a video game has decreased substantially. Like in all seriousness, I think the Silent Hill series, if I wasn't such a huge fan already, would serve as a pretty tough obstacle to me in my 40s. That being said, I think through the process of learning to critique and evaluate and understand video games, I've started to form an appreciation for puzzles that are really well made. So sometimes my appreciation for the puzzle as it's unwrapping itself in front of me can get me over that hump. I guess what I'm trying to say is I'm not quite where you are, but I am close enough to it that I could see why you would be there.
You fucking with Street Fighter 6? If so, who are you maining?
I keep saying that I'm going to give Street Fighter 6 a bit of time and learn its systems, but I just never get around to it. I've sort of put my hands on it a bit. I've had some time with Cammy and Marin, I think her name is, the ballerina fighting grappler. And to be honest, it's not really grabbing me right from the start the way that Street Fighter V did. But like I said, I haven't really given it enough time to say I do or don't like it. When I do get around to figuring it out though, I think I'm going to give Kimberly a try as a main. There's something about her visual style and the way that she moves that just clicks for me.
What is a belief you held about gaming early in your career that has completely changed today?
I think an easy answer for that question would be that survival horror is dead and we should let it die, because that was a belief I really stood behind for a long time, and that obviously ended up not being true. But like I said, that's an easy answer, and that's not what we're here for. I used to believe that I was a sort of barometer for normality. Like if I found something obvious about a video game or intuitive, that other people would also feel that way. I had a me bias, I guess you could say. And it took a little bit of growing up and a little bit of discussing stuff with people in the comment sections of my videos or through Twitter DMs or on live streams or interviews and podcasts. I finally figured out that like 95% of this stuff is just made up, and how I feel about something doesn't necessarily represent how it really exists out in the world to everybody else. So I try to stop stating things like they're facts now. I try not to sound like I know what I'm talking about, because while I know what I'm talking about for me, I don't know anything about you or anybody else who's watching. So I try to have a little bit more of an open mind and approach things a little more amicably, even when it's something I disagree with. Really, you could take that to mean that I stopped being combative and argumentative and started trying to actually understand what the person who was talking to me was saying. And man, I gotta tell you, life has been pretty fucking good ever since then. I find myself a lot less upset and mad about internet bullshit. It's pretty great.
What is your opinion on the skateboard survival horror game Skate Story, as someone who skateboards? Does it hit home in any way? And if no, what do you think would work as a skateboard horror story, survival horror game?
I'm not 100% sure that those two concepts complement each other very well. In fact, they might be polar opposites. This might be 100% the fault of Tony Hawk's Pro Skater, but if I see a skateboarding mechanic in a video game, the video gaminess of it pulls me out of the immersion that I think is so important for survival horror to have. Now, that being said, having a main character that skateboards or uses a skateboard, I don't know, maybe as a weapon, that sounds fine to me. But I don't think necessarily that skateboarding has to take place as a video game mechanic. In fact, I probably would rather it didn't.